name's Ian McMillan and I'm with the remarkable artist Iain Nicholls, who is a fellow Darfield resident and part of the kind of Darfield cultural renaissance, as I like to think of it. So Ian, just tell us a bit about your history as an artist.
Well, I grew up in Darfield. I always did art. I always drew, and when I was a teenager I used to make lots of models, tanks and dioramas and model railways. Never painted much, but I did lots of drawing, and I always knew I wanted to do art. And then I went to art college. I went to London, to Chelsea and Royal College of Art, and then I went into the big wide world.
And what have always impressed me about your art has been the different strands of it. Yeah. So I know that there's painting, watercolours, and different kinds of paint. There's virtual reality, and there's this current work that you're working on, which is models that become paintings. So maybe talk us through the different media that you use.
I mainly did drawing up until I was about 19, and then I started painting, and it was like that for quite a few years, apart from my teenage model making sort of thing. And then the last few years virtual reality occurred, and I used to make video games as a living, and I've always been into computers and computer graphics, and so I got into virtual reality, which involved making things in 3D, which I really enjoyed, and that sort of evolved into just recently, this last year, actually making physical models, which I found that I've really enjoyed doing as well. And then how I can combine that with painting. I paint the models are painted. I then do watercolours of the models, and there's a to and fro in between painting and model making, and I'm still going to be doing virtual reality at some point. So it's sort of spread out that I used to say I'm primarily a painter, but last few months I don't know anymore really. It's all a bit, I don't really worry about it, to be honest.
What strikes me as the two sides of your work is one side is very definitely rooted in place.
Yeah.
So we've worked together on pieces about Cat Hill, and we did a piece about a virtual reality thing about Emmyfield Pit.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect of it, and then there's a kind of totally imaginative aspect of it, where you just delve inside your head and pull things out.
Yeah, that's been in terms of drawing mainly. I've never really felt that comfortable with painting from my imagination. I used to do a lot, but I found it quite frustrating. Painting from places that mean something to me has been. So I grew up in Darfield. I moved away to London for a long time. I lived in America for a year, came back to London, and then I moved about 15 or 16 years ago back to Darfield and realised how fantastic the local landscape were, how interesting it were, and I started painting from photographs from the real world sort of thing, and it had to be places that meant something to me. In the same way that when I made an imaginative space, it meant something to me, even though it were invented. It still felt like, I think I've been trying to think of they seem quite separate, two strands of work, but I think maybe connecting thing is the real world is real, obviously real meaningful spaces, and then imaginative world is still a place in my mind, although it might look like just some quite abstract shapes maybe at some times. It's a place that means something to me, so that they are similar in a way.
What really you've taught me over the years about art is that it's about thinking. It's a process of thought.
Yeah.
Technique is part of it, a big part of it, but thought is where it begins for you, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I'm all right technically, but I know a lot of people who are a lot better than me. But it's not about that really. Unless it has to be, unless what you're doing needs some skill. But sometimes my work does need to spend a lot of time getting it accurate, and it has to be like that because that's what I want. But at other times that don't matter. Like these models that I'm making at the moment, They're more like a thumbnail sketch, but in 3D, so they don't have to be a finished off. They're not sculpture. They're more like just an idea that I need to get out in 3D. But then when I'm painting them as a watercolour, they have to be accurate. That's important. So everything's in context, really. Some of my models, if you looked at it just on its own, you'd think, well, that's an 8-year-old. That looks like made by an 8-year-old. But then, if seen all together at some point, hopefully there will be at some point, you'll hopefully get some connection between why they're done quickly and a bit. I sort of see them, and then white watercolours are pretty accurate. So maybe somebody will go, oh well, they're really well done, but they're like done by a 5-year-old. So what's that? What's going off there, sort of thing, And I sort of see them as if you're giving somebody some directions, maybe, or writing down a quick idea in a sketchbook. You're not thinking of the aesthetic beauty of it. You're just getting information down, and so. Partly, sometimes I work like that, but sometimes you have to work quite accurately, and it's all relative to each other.
Now we're sitting in this remarkable building in Elsecar. I'm thinking these days of Elsecar as the kind of left bank of Barnsley. It's a very artistic community. Tell us about the studio that you've got and the building that we're in.
Yeah, well, I was looking for a studio and I put the feelers out, and then John Tanner, who's mentioned these rooms that were going spare, and they used to be the waiting rooms of the Earl of Fitzwilliam's private railway, and they're all indoors, and then there's in one of the rooms there's a spiral staircase that goes down, and it went out to the platform, which is also covered over, and the steam train would come and park indoors, and they'd walk down the stairs from these rooms and get into the train and go wherever they were going. And it's fantastic to think that royalty maybe sat in my studio, because royalty visited what were the Earl of Fitzwilliam's private estate. There is some photographs of the Prince Albert, I think, coming out of this building.
And what is remarkable, I think, is that it's some heritage places are simply heritage. They simply look back. What I like about the fact that you're here as a contemporary artist is that what we're saying here in Barnsley is we can look to the past, but we can also look to the future. That artists like you, and hopefully one day a fantastic artistic colony here, can be looking to the future as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to. I have thought, how could I somehow connect this backstory of this building's past with what I'm doing now? And I can't quite work. I mean, I've not really thought of a good idea for doing that, but it'd be nice to do that at some point. Bring all this history that's lingering in these rooms into the modern world somehow. I don't know.
And I think it's great that an artist who spent a lot of time in London has come back here, because we are told that so much of what happens in London, which is true. But I think one thing about these strange times that we're going through is that the local will be appreciated, and the local can become the universal, as I often say. This can be part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that extends down to, I mean, one of my favourite painters, and I've got one of his pictures on my wall, is an artist called Joji Miranda, and all he did he painted most of his life. He painted shelves with some arrangements of bottles on them, and the most fantastic painter. You don't have to paint you don't have to do important, what is defined as important, current, zeitgeist or whatever. You can make fantastic work from local, from small things, from still lives. It's still what's the hierarchy of what is important. There used to be a hierarchy going from the religious pictures to kings and queens, and then people started painting peasants, and then they painted still lives. That hierarchy doesn't exist, and neither does local and being in the where it's at sort of thing. I don't think there is a where it's at anymore.
Well, I think what we're saying, what you're showing us, is that that these can be important places.
Yeah.
That here we are in this room, that is an important place. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.